Summarized. Thank you very much, Daniela, and welcome to everyone today. We're thrilled to see so many of you here today. As many of you will already know, NORRAG is a network of over 5,000 members, and we are committed to contributing to upholding the right to education, particularly access to quality and equitable education for all. And the way that we tend to do this is by addressing under-researched topics in key issues, such as data, and in this case today, missing education data. And the way that we do that, or the ways that we do that, is by producing knowledge. And we'll be discussing some of the discussion papers and background work that has been done today. We also broker policy dialogue, and we work on capacity strengthening as well. All of this underpinned with a principle of knowledge equity, always attempting to bring to the fore historically underrepresented groups and people. So NORRAG's strategy for the next 4 years are based around these 4 pillars. And the work that we do is very much analytical research. And in this particular session, we're focusing obviously on that data and evidence pillar of our strategy. And for this particular project on missing data, what we are doing is analytical research, which we will be presenting today and discussing going forward, in order to make sure that there is a better evidence base in order to improve understanding of this particular problem, and making sure that underrepresented peoples are being consulted, hopefully going forward, and that action can be taken. So this fundamentally is the beginning of a longer process. We've planned to have this particular project working all the way through to 2022, because 2022 is the midpoint between 2015 and 2030, where the Sustainable Development Goals deadline lies. And missing data continues to constitute a critical obstacle to achieving SDG 4 targets. And the challenges that are presented are manifold, and they are complex and complexly interrelated. And we're very pleased today to have a stellar bunch of speakers to introduce some of the problems that missing data poses to the achievement of SDG 4. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Laura Savage here today, who is the Executive Director of the International Education Funders Group, to open this summit for us. Laura.
Thanks, Moira, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. Great to see so many of you and such a diverse range. I've been tracking all the hellos in the chat, such a diverse range of people here today. And really what I want to do is to kick off this conference, this workshop, with a series of questions. And I think the questions that I raise will be far more familiar to you almost than to me. I've spent most of my career at working at the intersection of global education aid. I now work closer to philanthropy, but data has always been a huge part of it. I've spent the last 7 years in particular funding data and evidence. But the questions I want to pose today go back to the very start of my career, when I worked for the Director of Planning in the Ministry of Education in Malawi. So back then, we asked a series of questions, and I think those questions are as relevant today as they were back then, despite advancements in funding and technology and data and so forth. And these are the sets of questions that when Moira and NORRAG put the idea even of a missing education data conversation on the table, I thought, well, that's exactly the problem. That is exactly what we grappled with every single day within that Directorate of Planning. So there were kind of 4 big buckets. The first was a set of basic questions. Do we know how many students there are in the primary education schools? Do we know how many schools there are? And they feel like the most, in a way we were asking those questions and thinking, of course, surely we must know these, but they're not as easy as you all know. These are not as easy as they appear. And the answer was basically no, we don't know, because we didn't know how many 5-year-olds were out there. Birth registrations weren't necessarily universal, birth years weren't known, repetition policy complicated things in schools, so on and so forth. We also knew that not all schools were registered. And how on earth do you find out what you don't know? You don't know how many unregistered schools are out there. Data collection was pencil and paper, tool for the district education managers to get to the schools to do this data gathering was really scarce. So we didn't know the basics. The next thing we didn't know, and we felt that we didn't have a grasp on, was the money and the coordination around the money. So who's funding what, where, for whom? In a particular village, we know that one of the bilateral funders is doing a big project, and another in the same district, we knew that there were a bunch of NGOs being funded to do things that were complementary to the National Education Sector Plan. This was at a time of, post-Paris Declaration, huge coordination and alignment around the sector plan. But we didn't feel that we had a full grasp of all the money that was flowing within the country, even though some was at the time on budget report. We also didn't know, and I think still don't really know, how much things cost. So we had an approximate cost for salaries and books and bricks, but do we know the different activity costs? Do we know where they cost certain amounts versus in other places at different times? And the answer again was no. So we asked about the basics, we asked about the money. We then asked about the outcomes. And I think that's something that in the intervening years, we've all asked a lot more about. So do we know whether the kids, for all of this investment and all of this effort, are they learning? Do we know whether what we're funding is changing anything? Is it having an impact in this language of development discourse? And at the time, and I think, again, these are trends that you're going to be familiar with. We had national learning data, but then we also had learning data funded by a lot of the different projects and a lot of the different interventions in country. We didn't have citizen-led learning data, that has proliferated a lot since, but we had questions. Does everybody's data assessing learning meet the same criteria as our assessments of learning? Are they all done with the same levels of integrity, and can we compare them? Can we put them together? There was no collated database of everyone's assessment of learning. Those who funded some projects kept that to assess the impact of their own investment. It wasn't put together into one great national education system. Some data came out fast, some data took years. So often we were building sector plans on the basis of data that was 2 years out of date in terms of learning trends. And it didn't really give us, we weren't able within the systems to drill down to understand where are the learning trajectories that are growing fast, where students clearly are learning, and where are those that are static or falling. And I think there's been a lot of sophisticated analysis on learning trajectory since and over the years. So the final bucket of questions that we didn't have answers to then, and I guess I've spent a lot of my time trying to work out how we even get to the indicators on, is the data that unpacks why learning levels are low, why education outcomes don't match the investment going into them. Do we know why textbooks aren't being used? Do we know, we have, in some countries we've had service delivery indicator, World Bank survey telling us that teachers of grade 4 students don't know the content knowledge of what it is they're teaching. Do we know why? And we know, we have some data points from surveys like that, but we don't have that data on the proxies of system performance that is integrated again into those national education systems. So we don't have the story that links inputs to system proxies to education outcomes. So while we have some fantastic research out there that tells that story in a very concentrated way, it wasn't, and I think still isn't, easy to translate that into that data, that story on data and what the data tells us in the country. So my point here, I think, is that there's a lot of missing data. There's a lot of questions that we ask, no matter what our role in education around the world. There's a lot of questions to which answers are missing. And I wanted to kick off today with that set of questions that almost moves us beyond the specific data points that lie within the SDG goals. But I did want to offer also maybe a conversation point that unpicks the word data a little bit, because while I'm sitting here, I guess, saying that there is a huge amount of data that's missing, I think there's also a huge amount of data on the other hand. You know, there is a huge amount of data that isn't coordinated, isn't pulled together, isn't known, isn't available, isn't transparent. And I think there are big picture questions we need to ask about data too. So I've talked mainly about data related to foundational literacy, which is what I was working on back in Malawi when I worked as the director of planning. It's something I've worked a lot on since. But the data requirements for the wider SDG 4 are enormous, let alone the wider SDGs again. And to be blunt, I don't really know how we compare as an education community to those who are tracking progress against other SDGs. So I have a sense that we beat ourselves up a lot. I think within education, we tend to do that. And I think we also, on the other hand, try to strive for the sky, and we try to achieve everything at once. So some of those fundamental questions, I think, of data that I hope we have a chance in some of the chat rooms over the rest of today and the rest of this week we get to are things like, how does data relate to the decolonization agenda? So I've had some really interesting conversations recently around the idea of data cementing some of the inequities of aid, that we narrow things down to simple numerical forms, that global actors then through these metrics determine what success in education looks like, and that there's not enough space for voice, global voice. There are hard questions like the data, the requirements of global funders to track and to fill in all these, the sort of numbers to demonstrate impact to their investments, produce a data-driven culture, and that there's a north-south divide in the demand for data coming from the north. On the flip side, I think I would question whether that itself is a bit of an outrageous caricature of north being data-driven, south not. I think there's also a set of governance questions here around data that, recognizing that all these questions I've raised around education in a certain country, in a certain context, are probably similar to those being asked in other sectors. So what is the bigger picture, kind of sector agnostic data work that we need to link in with? So I'm gonna leave today. I'm not gonna try and give a view on any of these questions today, but I did want to open with a bunch of questions, because I think a lot of the conversations that we're going to have over the next couple of days are, I hope, going to be very practical, pragmatic, positive, debate and discourse as to how we get beyond this word of missing, and we work together to support a journey towards a point where data is more open, more shared, where we're supporting local education evidence ecosystems. And that while I don't think we should ever see data and evidence as a silver bullet or something that's just going to, in a linear way translate automatically into better education outcomes, that we do support these ecosystems to be better informed by locally led, globally produce, this whole dynamic of data that comes, that is of a high quality, that is shared globally, and that is then applied locally. We need to be building those strong feedback loops to strengthen the accountability systems that then back up and in time, in their messy, nuanced way, lead us all together towards those better outcomes. So Moira, that's what I wanted to kick off with today. I'm looking forward to hearing the other speakers today and getting into these breakout groups where we can hopefully unpack some of these knotty issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for opening the summit and highlighting all of those different problems, data-related problems, and also critically, I think the paradox of the fact that we are swimming in data for certain things, for certain purposes, about certain groups, and yet not for others. So thank you so much for that. And now I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to our next speaker, who is Daniel Shepherd, who is the project lead for us here at NORRAG on the Missing Data project. And he will now take the floor and introduce the next speakers as well after he has spoken. Daniel.
Thank you very much, Moira. Thank you, Laura, for those interesting questions that are still so pertinent. So thank you for helping us kick things off today. So I wonder if we could, if you guys would be willing, often we're on Zoom these days and we don't have a chance to interact with one another, and I see some interesting interactions in the chat. So what we propose to do is just spend a quick 5 minutes. We're going to randomly send you all into a group with about 1 or 2 other people. And we just ask you to spend those 5 minutes, just briefly introduce yourself, you know, who you are, where you're from. There might be some mismatches by language, so move around if you can't communicate with each other. And why you're here. So just briefly introduce yourself and why you're here. And it won't be a perfect match with the diversity of languages, but hopefully you'll get to meet someone interesting in the process. We'll then quickly close them after a few minutes and come back for the next set of speakers. So I think the room should be ready. Okay, great. So I think we're all back. Can everyone see my screen? And switch to share screening to my side.
Yep, that's fine.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Moira. So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed meeting each other briefly. I will be the first speaker in kind of our next little series of discussions, after which we'll have some, I hope, quite active Q&A with all of you involved. So my name is Daniel Shepherd, as Moira mentioned. I'm leading the Missing Data project. I will be speaking briefly, followed by Marcos Del Prado, who will be speaking, who's a professor at the University of Sussex. And then we'll also be having a discussion joining us, Rafaela Martinez, who will be speaking from some of her reflections based on the overall discussions that myself and Marcos will say, and she'll be joining us from the perspective of GPE. So thank you very much again for all joining us, and I will just go ahead and move forward. So a brief introduction to the project, adding on to what Moira shared. So the timeline is this year and next year. So this is the beginning of a conversation, and we look forward to having your contributions, including from your questions and comments today. And the idea is really to contribute to conceptualizing and addressing the gaps in education data specific to SDG 4 and the overall data regime or data system. The activities will include events such as this one, as well as expert consultations, smaller meetings based on invitation, as well as publications, both policy-facing think pieces, as well as more research-related publications. And we intend to have a book at the end of the project if we're successful in that endeavor. So that's a bit about the project. So now I just want to give you a bit of an overview about how we've been thinking about missing education data and why we've been thinking about it. And some of this touches on the reflections that Laura shared already. So the first is that there's just this really increase in data. There's this high increase in data over the past years. And this increase has advantages and opportunities, but also it creates potential challenges because we might be so overwhelmed with the data that are there that we miss where data are still missing and miss groups that are still left out. To give you an idea of how much data has increased visually, because it's hard to think about zettabytes, exabytes, from the beginning of humanity until 2003, the approximate estimate is about 5 exabytes were created. However, in 2010, that jumped dramatically, so much so that you can barely see the 5 exabytes anymore in the graph to 800 exabytes. In 2020, just 10 years later, the estimate was 59 zettabytes. And then you can see relative to the others, how much data that is. So there's a lot of data there, but also there's still important gaps. And we might, again, get distracted from the data that are there and inadvertently marginalize those who are already marginalized. The other reason is important kind of normative commitments that we've all made as an international community, both within SDG 4 and education, to have data disaggregation, but also more kind of broadly, to Laura's point again, of building the data capacity and statistical capacity of countries around the world across sectors. So we also have SDG 17 and the indicators related to data under that. There's also been a number of action plans related to data that I've been committed to, including recently the Cape Town Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development. But obviously data doesn't come free and data use doesn't come free. So the estimated costs, although they're very much ballpark figures, was that it'll cost between 3 and 6 billion USD annually to generate the data needed for the SDG framework. The lower bound is the estimate for just generating data. The upper bound is both generating and using data, because we don't want data to just sit on a shelf somewhere. So there are many ways that we could look at the question of missing data and missing education data in particular. We've decided to start with a fairly simple 3-part framework. So what types of indicators are missing, the missing types of data, if you will. What groups of people might be missing within the data, missing groups, and what purposes are not well served by the data system. So what uses are the data not being put towards, that they could be put towards, or what uses are difficult to achieve because of the structure of things. So missing types, missing groups, and missing purposes. I will give a bit of an introduction on some thinking on the first 2, just from a very broad global perspective. And later on, we'll have a keynote by Soteria Grech thinking about the purposes question as well. Both Marcos and I will be speaking on types and groups primarily and touching a little on purposes. So moving on, don't get distracted by the details of this line graph, but I just want to tell a story about if we look at the global data, so the data that's housed by UIS at UNESCO, and think about how many countries out of the total countries are reporting on some of the indicators on each of the targets for SDG 4 by groups of years. So these are pairs of years bundled together. And has that improved since the SDGs have kicked off in 2015, 2016? And the story that this graph shows, although there's lots of detail hidden within it, is that the lines are fairly flat in the second half of the graph, in the middle to the end. So there's been more or less stagnation in the proportion of countries that are reporting on these targets. Some slight decreases in some areas even, and some slight increases in others, and others have been bouncing around a little bit. So something is going on, and business as usual has not improved the data picture, it seems, in the past years since the beginning of the SDG agenda. So then that raises the question of why. So of course, these targets, they mask some details because they're indicators within each target. So you might have been surprised to see such high coverage for 4.1, which is on learning and completion data. But if you look at the indicators, you'll see quite a lot of differences in terms of trends, but also in terms of levels. So in terms of trends, you'll see that some of the indicators, like out of school rate, percentage of over age for their grade, have decreased slightly since the kickoff of the SDG 4 agenda. Others have slightly increased or stayed about the same. These are indicators like 4.16 on whether or not there's a national learning assessment or years of free and compulsory education that are essentially just single data point at the national level. So there's large differences in trend and level across the indicators in each target. And then within each of those, there's also these big level differences that are quite dramatic in some of the targets. So this is looking at the ECD, the Early Childhood Development and Education 4.2 indicators. And you'll see that we have much better coverage when it comes to data on enrollment and participation pre-primary. but much less when it comes to questions about are children aged 2 to 5 developmentally on track? Is there a positive home environment? And part of this might be the structure of the system. What data sources are we relying on for each of these indicators? And part of it might also be that it's easier to get data from institutions that are linked more closely to the Ministry of Education, as opposed to data from other places, such as the home environment. But as we're starting to think not just about indicators, but about groups, you'll see that there's perhaps some bigger gaps and bigger challenges when it comes to coverage of certain age groups. We just looked at ECD, so the pre-primary children, but also when you look at youth, you'll see that the coverage is quite poor. Here you'll see these 3 indicators related to youth on 4.3, and the coverage is about from half all the way down to 10, 20%. Other groups of individuals that we might be missing in the data system are teachers. So we don't necessarily have great coverage on teacher data, and the hope is with the recent initiatives to standardize the ISCID, the kind of qualified teacher indicators, that hopefully that will improve. But we know teachers are incredibly important for the education of children and youth and anyone in schooling. And so we need to also think carefully about why we have data gaps when it comes to teachers. So that was thinking in terms of targets and indicators, but already started to allude to groups. If we think about groups as disaggregation, we'll see even a little bit more nuance as far as where we're seeing some missing data and what the trends are. So if we look at sex disaggregation or gender disaggregation and poverty disaggregation and rural disaggregation and disability disaggregation, these are those 4 little boxes at the bottom, you'll see that all of them are telling a similar story of stagnation or decline in terms of coverage of data since 2015-2016 period. You'll see that the first of those, the disaggregation by whether or not you're male or female, perhaps has the best coverage across some of the indicators. And these are again bundled up into the target, so it's hiding a lot of nuance. Whereas you'll see that there's quite poor and declining coverage when it comes to disaggregation by poverty level, so the poorest quintile, or by rural, or by disability. So this is all drawing from the global data that's available from UIS's bulk data download. But obviously we know that place matters. So where is the data missing, right? One way to look at where it's missing is in conflict affected countries. And so you'll see, we won't get into the details of this slide, but just to talk about the importance of place when it comes to missingness as well. And some of the indicators have a similar pattern when it comes to conflict affected, and some of them are better or worse. Also, when we think about the data and place, we need to think about the level that we're concerned with. So here, if we think about the data source that I was just presenting, was at the global level, the data housed by UIS. But these are, of course, reported by countries. There's a bit of a time lag. So maybe that last data point there is due to time lag or COVID. And because data don't exist in the global data set, does not mean they don't exist at the national data level. So perhaps they do exist at the national level, but they're not reported or they're not comparable or there's other challenges. So because data exists or because they're missing at one level does not necessarily imply that they exist or are missing at another level. Similarly, when we think about subnational, right, there might be administrative data that's collected at a district level or maybe even at the entity of a school that's not been reported somewhere else because that school needs it, or there's a project there, or there's, as Laura was saying, there's an entity implementing something or funding something. And these different levels might be speaking well to each other, or they might not be speaking well to each other, vertically, but also horizontally, if you're thinking about different organizations or ministries. So with that, I want to conclude on my kind of introduction to how we've started thinking about missing education data. You'll have very many more interesting presentations to follow. But please do jot down any questions that you had. We'll have a Q&A session after the 3 presentations. So any questions you have for me or for Marcos or for Rafaela. So if you have any questions, please write them down and we'll move to those later, but not at this moment. So thank you very much for listening. And with that, I'll introduce Dr. Marcos Del Prado to take the floor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, hello.
I can hear you, Marcos.
Yeah, how do I share the screen? Okay, share screen, fine, 1 second. Can you see it okay?
We see the full screen. I don't know if you want to make it full screen mode. We can see your outline on the left.
Ah, okay. Oh, but sorry. Let me do it again. Sorry, I have a problem here. Can you see okay now?
Wonderful.
Yes?
Wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to be part of this summit. I do think it's a really important event because essentially it's like a stop into the monitoring framework in an important point toward the deadline to check what is actually conceptually and analytically missing from the SDG framework for better targeting and to reach this advantage. So I will present some ideas based on that, following up from what Daniel introduced. So let me, okay, so the outline of the presentation. First, I will give a quick introduction. Then I will review very briefly the existing platforms of monitoring SDG 4, quality education. In the third part, I will introduce the conceptual framework essentially for and learning indicators. We'll introduce the missing framework data set that we actually produced alongside Daniel. And then I will produce I will show you some brief results about missing patterns on the existing monitoring platforms, and I will conclude. So to begin with, so what is the aim of the presentation? The aim of the presentation is essentially to put out some ideas related to what sort of group, the subgroups that could be included within SDG 4, particularly those groups which are actually furthest left behind, where these groups are facing a lot of different disadvantages or compounded layers of disadvantage. So, although I mean the bottom line really of the framework, of the missing data framework we are proposing, is that information is actually present in household and learning surveys, but is not actually used in the particularly in the UIS database. So what is the rationale? The rationale is that, again, that information can be gathered, can be obtained from the household and learning surveys, which actually are used to monitor SDG 4. We will divide this new information between one dimensions, essentially when you break the data between one group, 2 dimensions when you combine 2 dimensions, say for instance, location and gender, and 3D overlaps when you combine, say, gender, location, and wealth, right? How we actually come up with the framework essentially is a compilation of empirical research of different framework which actually are used in different empirical papers, which is in fact more comprehensive and which allow us to identify the missing groups and types as early presented by Daniel. So what are the key elements of the data set, the framework, the missing framework data set? The first point is essentially that we don't actually, I mean, we argue that we shouldn't be using the same drivers or the same element of inequalities, driving inequalities across the different indicators. So we might want to have some indicators or some breakdowns of the data at primary level, a different one for lower secondary, upper secondary, and above. So it's not static. The drivers are not static across the different indicators. The second element is that we can we can divide the driver according to different levels of inequality. So you might have some inequality drivers at the child or the youth level. You might have different drivers of inequality at the household levels and also the community or the school level. And this is important because essentially that will allow us to have more like a concentric, or if you like, a stage degree of inequality according to the different levels where an indicator is measured at. And finally, we also introduce crossovers of SDG 4 with SDG 5, which is about gender inequality. Essentially, as you might know, SDG 5 is about gender inequality, and we will actually introduce drivers related to girls and mothers' empowerment, which could happen at the household at the community level. And they're important because if you think about education production or the education performance, they are very much related as well about to social norms, what's actually happening in a community from the point of view of the mother empowerment on expenditures, or the mother, whether the mother is early married, etc. So these four, they are the key elements of the MISI framework, conceptual framework. So after the brief introduction, so what are the existing platforms to monitor SDG 4? So as you know, we have the UIS data set, which systematically collects data covering all targets of SDG 4, but also we have from UNESCO the GMR, we go the wide database, which is a monitoring tool for particularly focus on equality, on an array of indicators as well, on access. It could be that where people are in a school, out school, completion rates at the different levels, primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and so on, and learning indicators. Or you may have from the side of learning as well, a specific database or data sources like PISA or different learning, international learning surveys, TEENS, PEARLS, or TERCE, etc. So if after describing this monitoring platform and checking the driver of inequalities, we can see that from the point of view of UIS, and you can see here, for access and completion, access, whether kids or youth are in a school or out school, and completion rates, again, completion rates at primary level, lower secondary, upper secondary, and higher education as well. So you see that the UIS only one dimension, so one level of breaking down the data, the drivers of the division of the data, the way it is the data monitor, is a wealth, location, which stands for L, and gender. The same one are used in white, but in addition, the white database from the Global Education Monitor report include ethnicity, religion, and region. When we move into the two dimensions overlap, so we see that the UIS use gender and location, and gender and wealth. The same two dimensions are used as well in the white database, but the white database have this additional crossovers, or the two dimensions crossover, which is, for instance, wealth and location, gender and ethnicity, location and region, etc., etc. And when we move to the third dimensions, overlaps of the data, we got the standard combinations are gender, location, again, location is urban and rural location, and then wealth. The same one is used for white, but white, I think that it has an additional breakdown of the data, which is very, very relevant, is gender, wealth, and also the region, because that will allow a country to a better targeting per region, right? If we move to learning, and we compare, in that case, we add the PISA as well, we see that the one dimensions of breaking down the data is similar. Essentially, the three leading driver of inequality, which is gender, location, and wealth, but on top of that, we have issues related to language, or whether the immigration status. But when we move to the 2 dimensions, breaking down the data, we can see the UIS is not reporting that, whereas white and PISA do report it. In the case of white, we have that is also learning data broken down by location and wealth, gender and location, gender and language, etc. Also, UIS doesn't break down the data in the US platform for the 3 dimensions. So we know a combination like in white, which for instance include gender, location and wealth, so gender, language and location, etc. So if I have to step back and think a little bit about what the monitoring platform is actually for SDG 4 are allow us to monitor, we can see that UIS main categories is location, again, urban and rural locations, gender and wealth, and some combinations in some cases, only for access and completion. White, on the other hand, employed additional subgroups. These subgroups are ethnicity, region, and religion. Particularly, they are available, these groups in the DHS and the mixed data sets. If we move to literacy and attainment, UIS drivers are restricted to gender and location. The same ones are in white with additional combinations. But particularly important is that UIS doesn't include overlaps at the 2 dimensions, at 3-dimensional level for learning indicators. And although white and PISA do that, they don't include key informations, like for instance, school type. But so the breaking down of learning indicators by public and private school, or the level of the socioeconomic status of the schools, for instance, or infrastructure. So there is missing information, not only in UIS, also in white's, particularly in white data platform, monitoring platform. So I mean, given what I've been saying so far, we want to think in a different framework to better utilize employ the available information on households and learning surveys. So our focus, in a way more aligned to white, if you like, data set, is in inequality. We rely on some empirical studies, but which we're trying to focus in layers of source of inequalities, which they begin at the childhood or the household level and they move outwards towards, say, the household or the community or the school, because that's the way the inequalities are reproduced, essentially, in a conceptual way. And we argue that it's a better way a more efficient way to monitor SDG 4. If I have to represent that the framework, I have to get rid of the one here. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. If we have to think about the representation of the framework, we can think of at the very bottom, at the core of the inequality, is the situation of the youth, of the child. Then we have the household, and then we have the community for the case of access and completion. So the different breaking down of the data at the different levels used in the current UIS or white platform is the one which are actually in black letter, but we think that there are additional elements or driver of inequality which they're available in the data set which are not currently used. For instance, in the case of the use of the child, we have issues pregnancy, so we could be teenage pregnancy or empowerment. At the household levels, beyond wealth, we might have additional drivers like math literacy, and we know that it's more likely the inequality widen, the less educated that child's mother is. We might have issues related to the family composition, demographic factors, and also if we move towards the community level, we might have issues beyond the location of the region, issues related to the development of the community, or issues related to the education quality in the community, or it could be even the stunting of the community, or the rate of stunting, which is a key element of the returns of education in a community, if you like. And similarly, for learning, following the same concentric approach to inequalities, we can see that we can include further information like the disability of whether a child is disabled or not, whether the child is working, whether the child actually previously attended preschool, or whether the child is indigenous or not. At the household level, we might have information related to educational parental input, whether the parents read to the kids or not, whether the mother is an immigrant, the language spoken in the family, and also at the school. And we know that most of the inequality in the education system happen, the strongest influence happen at the school level. We might have issues related to be able to include related to the teacher qualifications, the level, the average socioeconomic status of the school, the infrastructure of the school, where the proportion of children working in the school, which they will magnify the degree of inequality. So another key element in our framework is that this expanding from the youth to the household and the community inequality, we try to think about the concept of compounded disadvantage. So essentially the crossover across the different levels of inequalities. So what is the process to construct or to think about building up a data set? So essentially we have our framework first, which I told you that is like a layer conceptual degree of inequality, from individual to the household, to the community, or to the school. Then with that framework, we compare it to the UIS database, and we come up with a new possible conceptual generic data set, which is the MF, the missing framework data set. This missing framework data set will have basically two elements. The first one, it will be like whether there are missing combinations in the UIS database, or whether they're missing new groups that they're not actually included and they're very relevant. As I mentioned before, it could be element related to indigeneity, it could be driver related to teenager pregnancy, etc. And then we will actually come up with these patterns of missing on these new dimensions that we are actually proposing. To give you an example, here, I don't know whether you can see the slide very well, but essentially, if we pick one indicator, in that example is read primary, essentially the score in reading at primary level. So the standard breaking down drivers is gender and location, but as I mentioned to you earlier on, they are missing combinations. So we don't have information about female, whether between gender and location. So we don't have information, for instance, on the level of achievement in reading by gender, by females, and whether a female is urban or female is living in a rural area, etc. And similarly, we can think about new groups as well. So the first part will be about missing combinations. So combination that could be actually present in the data set, and the second part is new groups that we think they're very relevant. So if you think about the performance at the primary level in reading of a random child, a key element it would be whether the child is working or not. So that we think there's a very important group to include. It also could be about the level of that kids mother education, or where, and also what school he's attending. And we know that public school, they tend to have a different, if you like, equilibrium or a lower performance in comparison to private school in segregated education systems. So we can propose new groups. We think that it's very relevant to propose, as this example, all these new groups, which it will lead to all these combinations. When you think about, for instance, you mixing whether the child is actually working and the mother education, you will see that the breaking down the data, it could include the reading for a child who is working, and also the mother is lower educated as a one subgroup, additional subgroup. So we have a data set that which can be obtained from NORRAG upon request, this conceptual data set. So what are the main findings of the data set? So if you take all the indicators and the missing combinations, according to the framework we propose, we see that we have around nearly 300 two dimensions, the overlap between two characteristics missing across I think 10 indicators in the UAS SDG4 framework, and also more than nearly 100 or 96 three dimensions overlaps, or three crossover between characteristics. If you look at the combinations, most of the combinations, I know our framework is heuristics and in a way is ad hoc, but most of the new dimensions we're proposing and the combinations and the missing combinations, most of the missing happen in learning indicators. For instance, here is math, the grade 2 and grade 3, the performance in math grade 2 and grade 3, then math at lower secondary. So all learning indicators, they tend to have nearly 52 missing combinations. And then we do have as well around 10 and below missing combination from completion rates at different levels or out school rates. So that from the point of view of missing combinations. From the point of view of missing new groups, so what is the new group we actually proposing to include in the monitoring framework? We have for 2 degree overlap, 2 dimensions overlap, we have 41 groups, and 3 dimensions overlap, 17 groups. New groups, as an example, new group we're proposing whether a child or a student is working, include also the mother education as a driver of inequality on the performance of a specific indicator of a child. Also, we are proposing as a key element school information. It could be different type of infrastructure. It could be, for instance, ICT infrastructure, the degree of bullying or violence in the school type, whether the school is public or private, also the teacher qualification in the school, and also demographic information, empowerment of mothers, and also region. Among the new groups, most of the 2 dimensions categories we are proposing, they are communities background characteristics, like the community development, the wealth, the degree of empowerment in the community. Essentially, that there will be like a right. It could be of teenage pregnancy in a community. It could be a right from the point of view of empowerment, or a rate of early marriage in the community, also health. And then for 3 dimensions, or the overlap between 3 characteristics, the main one we are proposing is a crossover between gender, the region, and the school socioeconomic status. So to reiterate, for learning, our thinking is again moving outward from what the degree of inequality in the child of the student to the family, and then to the school conditions from the point of view of infrastructure and poverty in the school. And for a completion and access indicator, we think that the combination between the community information crossover with the region are key, embedded within social norms of empowerment. Because again, empowerment is really important from the point of view of the transmission of education across generations and how that inequality is passed from one generation to the next, from mothers to daughters, or from mothers to boys. The two dimensions and three dimensions overlap. We think again about an incremental and cumulative geographical length for targeting. As an example, we can take, for instance, CR1, which is the primary completion rate. We can divide this indicator between the value between urban and rural community, and then we can cross it over with the degree of poverty in the community and the regions. So you think about that example, you will be able to have, you will know which region the indicator is on, whether the community in the region is a poor or rich community, and also whether that community is local, is a urban or rural. So they will allow you more like a geographical granular targeting on the specific data, rather than having like a lamp indicator between urban and rural communities. So to conclude, the first point is missing data, as explained by earlier on by the previous speakers, can exacerbate the degree of marginalization. So if you give an indicator only breaking down very simple in a very simple way, you will be ignoring a lot of information how inequality is challenged through. So that it will lead to an exacerbation of the degree of marginalization. So our heuristic framework use new groups addressing channels of systemic inequalities. The systemic inequalities essentially, from the point of view of learning indicators, it will happen about the structure and the different subsystems of education from the point of view of learning indicators. So as an example, we can think about public school and a private school. We can think about poor public schools or rich, if you like, a private school, subsystems. And then from the point of view of communities, the second channel of systemic inequalities, in which we actually embed social norms from the point of view of empowerment indicators like early marriage, teen pregnancy, and development of the community, which is a continuous index. So I think I'm done. I don't know how well I did with the time. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos, for those interesting reflections. So now I would like to invite our discussants, Ms. Rafaela Martinez, Education Policy and Learning Team Lead at the Global Partnership for Education, to share some of your reflections with us all. So Marcos, you can stop sharing your screen.
Yes, sorry, I have to see it. I don't know, 1 second. Hold on, I got missed out. Oh. Sorry, 1 second here. I have a media problem here. I see. I don't. Yeah, it was out somewhere else. Sorry.
Great. Now we turn over the floor to you, Rafaela. You're on mute, I think. We have to. We didn't make you co-host. Sorry. I will unmute you then. Daniela, could you please make her a co-host or unmute her? Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, you have.
I was stuck. I couldn't
Like,
unmute myself. That's fine. You didn't want me to speak. No. Okay. Well, thank you so much for a great presentation, really, Marcos, and also the introductory remarks, Danielle. I think, the presentation is very interesting and relevant for the implementation of our new GP strategy and model. And as a discussant coming from the Global Partnership for Education, I will situate my remarks more at country level, just like you explained, Danielle, that before getting to the global level, data actually comes from national level and EMIS in particular, but other set of data as well. And so from a country level perspective, but also a policy making and delivery perspective, just like Laura also talked earlier in the introduction. Because that's where we want to make a difference at GP, by supporting reforms that are transformative in complex systems. So our new GP strategy and model are about incentivizing system transformation. And these days, I mean, with the current crisis, COVID crisis, but also the learning crisis, there's a strong appetite to build forward better. And that's what our board has requested us. And in particular, the ministries of education of our partner countries. I mean, the sort of things we've been hearing was like, we don't want business as usual. We need to accelerate progress. Please make the countries where they are and be GP more adaptive. So we want to support shifts that have ripple effects across the system in order to achieve impact at scale. And so for this, we need data, analytics, and evidence. And it's quite the foundational block of our operating model in many aspects. So we need data and analytics for governments and their partner to devise sound public policies, to design relevant programs and interventions that speak to the root causes of the issues. So getting deeper into the reasons of why the system dysfunctions and why specific groups are not learning at school. And in this regard, the work of Marcos about further disaggregation is quite critical to better understand the why and then having the right programs and intervention in place. We need data for monitoring progress. SDG 4 is one example, tracking results. But clearly, I mean, like from a GP perspective, of course, monitoring progress is important because you can then course correct on the basis of what you're seeing, how your implementation is progressing, but also for developing greater accountability among the stakeholders at country level that partner for system transformation. So it's an alliance of partners and having greater accountability among the different stakeholders. And I mean, finally, obviously as well, we need data and analytics to guide investments, to support prioritized allocation of the scarce resources that we have, so from public finance, but also international aid. And yeah, I mean, given the ongoing uncertainty, it's quite clear that successful recovery would depend, and building back better would depend on strong data systems at country level, including for informing the international monitoring frameworks like SDG 4. And the availability of accurate, timely, reliable, easily accessible data for immediate response, but also more longer-term preparedness planning is extremely important and requires leveraging existing data, as we just spoke earlier. But also we need to incentivize and build new approaches to data collection that are probably like lighter, more flexible to track learners. For example, through our very recent COVID grant investments, we learned that many of the education management information systems that we've been supporting for the past decades don't have the ability to adapt to the very fast evolving nature of our current environments. So, I mean, this is just like areas where GP is thinking about where we need to direct the resources of our partnership, that are financial resources, but also knowledge resources, expertise resources. But to respond a little bit more directly to the topic of the summit about the missing data that matters even more than ever, I mean, we at GP, we would say yes to that. There are some data gaps, like, I mean, we talked about that earlier. Data to count the invisible, the most vulnerable groups, for instance. We had also, especially because our model is very much geared towards domestic financing and trying to increase the allocation of total budget to education, we realized that at global level, we had issues finding reliable and timely data on finance, public finance. The same on data on learning. And also, you know, when we're working at country level, actually, even before we get to the education data sets, just like very macro data challenges like population censuses. And in many countries that we're basically working with, it's a missing information, so we can calculate relevant and adequate indicators. But from a policy perspective, I would say that what remains more challenging, and that's probably like where I'd like also to have the audience reflecting on, is the actual use of data. And all of the speakers earlier just referred to that. And when we work with partners at country level, for instance, the first thing that we say to partners is, look around, there's plenty of data that we can make speaking in our sector. You have administrative data through education management information systems, there's learning data through learning assessment systems for exams, household data, we spoke about that. We also have actually financial data in budget reports that are posted online. And that's, for instance, I mean, we worked very closely with US a few years ago to develop a new methodological approach where the missing domestic financing data could be computed from the budget reports that are posted online. So there are data everywhere. It's just a matter of like, how do we turn those data into meaningful information? And that's probably where we think, at least in the GP partner countries, where we think there is a critical need, which is investing and building into human resources, local workforce and capacities, so we can work the consolidation of data across different sources of information, but also helping local human resources to use effectively data. So, for instance, there's a lot of our programs that are investing into capacities to process, analyze, and use data. And also because we think that for ensuring the sustainability of the country data systems, you have to train and qualify a workforce to produce and use the data. So that creates a virtual cycle of asking for more data because they are in use. And I'm going to get to that in my conclusion. There is also another set of questions that we have at GP, which is, and I think, Laura, you talked about it in introduction, how do we make data accessible and easy to use? I mean, just like I said, there are often data sets that are difficult to access or that are scattered across different ministries, different partners. And maybe like some of us just said, there's simply too much data produced. But aside of like being a little bit provocative, what I really want to say is that we need to invest into effective access and dissemination strategy of those data. And for that, we need to know the audience, adapt the format of your data to the purpose that they should serve, incorporate more visualization, specialization, make them accessible and understandable to policymakers so we can actually use them. And just to finish, because I'm probably going to start to be a little bit long, but at global level, what is important to understand, I mean, like, it's important to understand where we stand in achieving SDG 4 and having a full coverage of SDG 4 indicators is important, but not sufficient to solve the learning crisis. And maybe one thing that I would like to continue reflecting with all of you is how we think in a continuum from data production to actual delivery at country level for ensuring inclusive, equitable quality education for all children. So I think we need the global community to do a better job at presenting a data theory of change, explaining how having reliable and easily accessible data and information is critical for dramatically and quickly improving education outcomes. And I guess, I mean, there's many successful examples of education policies and reform that were developed and implemented on the basis of robust data and evidence. And maybe that's where we should also like join our efforts and try to identify the good examples of how investing in more and better data leads to greater education outcomes. And I'm just going to finish here.
Thank you so much for that, Rafaela, and also to Daniel and Marcos before you. So I think the questions that have been coming up in the chat, we've had quite a few, and I'm trying to group them. There were several that rather than being questions were saying, what about these other types of missingness. So I've noted all of those, and we'll be able to move forward with those. I think the first question, really, just to pick up on what you just said, Rafaela, which is from Dr. Mahmoudi, is actually then saying, if we have this performance indicator, are these performance indicators actually good enough? Is there something that needs to then be looked back at to say, if we have these targets and performance indicators, what maybe needs to be changed in that? So that's one question. I'll just give you two more and then you can answer them together. Then there were a few questions around the SDGs being a universal agenda. Can we actually deal with the questions that you've raised in all countries around the world? Do we have the tools that would actually make it possible to do that across all countries around the world? And then there was a question around these global tests, where some of them are done in some countries and not in others, and just any reflections that you had on those tests in particular, given the data challenge and the missing data challenge. And then potentially referring that back to Laura's comments at the beginning about decolonization and how we actually relate those tests to some concepts of decolonization. So 3 questions to our 3 speakers. Whoever would like to take which question, please go ahead.
You want to start or no?
Go ahead, Marcos.
I think it was a really good comment, actually, I think from Cecilia, that I think that the starting point of any sort of exercise to address inequalities, you have to, rather than actually using homogeneous categories across country, you have to focus on what the core inequalities coming from for that particular country. So if I have to look at learning indicators, if I think about Latin America, where I come from, I will look essentially at education systems. I will look issues related to school types, issues related to language, etc. And then I will build upwards for inequality from the point of view. So that, in a sense, is related to the trade-off between an homogeneous type of monitoring and country-specific monitoring. But in the presentation, what we try to do in my presentation, what I try to do with Daniel, that is essentially to give like a sort of equilibrium to the balance between a generic monitoring and specific country challenges through this framework, which have to be concentric and have to look at inequalities at least in 3 layers and pick essentially which is the starting layer of inequality to monitor by using current data. I think that's a starting point for me. I don't know whether I replied in a side way in one of the questions, no, but probably I didn't make it clear in the presentation. So I didn't take my notes, that's why, sorry.
Thank you. Daniel?
I'll just briefly add to what Marcos said, and I would kind of combine the first 2 questions around, if I understood well, the first one about, are these the indicators that we need to inform action or policy or program changes? And this idea about universalized or comparable indicators. And I think to kind of Rafaela's point is we need to think about which indicators matter, and Marcus's point just now about national level, like which indicators matter and have informed policy changes before in a way that was useful. And that might be because we'll never have a perfect data system. So we need to think about what is the data we need to reach the educational outcomes that we want. And that might help us to some degree prioritize in a way that leads to more informed policymaking for education.
Thank you.
I mean,
Rafaela?
I can speak for, yeah, I can speak for question one. And again, like from the perspective of GPE, and definitely the answer to the question of performance indicators enough, for us, the answer is no. And the performance indicators are important in terms of signaling like what doesn't work in a quick way. But that's where the actual work starts. When you have your performance indicators that are showing some deficiencies, then the key question is the why. And that's where, and that's what I was saying in my remarks, that's where the work of Marcus becomes so important, because that's when you dig further and you look at the different layers, which are the drivers of exclusion, and that's where we're going to be able to understand the real why and get away from just the symptom, but really the root causes of the issues, and then plan the right interventions that would speak to the causes of the issues and not just the symptoms. Because very often what we've been seeing in countries that we've been supporting, especially through education sector plans, there was a tendency of having interventions or strategies that would respond to the first layer of issues, the symptoms. And actually it wouldn't work so well, because there was just like such an infrastructure behind of the symptoms that were not regarded enough, and the interventions were not as relevant. So it's important, but it's not sufficient.
Thank you
And
very
then
much.
maybe to touch briefly on the other two questions, if I may, Moira.
Please.
On the different tests and also decolonization, I wanted to just flag some other streams of work related to this project. So we're also having regional discussions and regional papers that are trying to look at what are the issues when you go down at least a lower level, moving from the global to the regional. And so those will be coming out in 2022, and that won't necessarily address all those sorts of concerns, but some of those issues around different tests in different regions. And also, I think that is relevant for this question about decolonization and which kind of agendas are being followed when it comes to data creation.
Great. Thank you very much. Right. We had quite a few questions about African countries, and just so people know, we have one of the people who's working on the regional paper for Africa speaking at the very end of this meeting, and then we will be working up regional papers at another time. Then also in terms of questions, we had Hamida asked a questions about complications due to COVID, if anybody would like to come in on that. And then also there were questions about data being unreliable, or is it the data is available, but the systems are actually misfunctioning. And so the question there about the data systems, and how that sort of complex interrelationships actually work. Thank you.
So I think the question about kind of data reliability, availability versus use, right? That's very much touching on a lot of the conversations that are starting to bubble up. And I think the later session with Soteria will also dig more into this. But I think this is a key question, because as we've all mentioned, there's data that exists that aren't being used that could be useful. And so we need to understand better, why are they not being used? Is it because of reliability issues, capacity issues, technical issues about connecting different data systems? And I think this is especially an important question at the national level, because really that's where there's the most rich data environment, where data can be brought together to inform policies, more so than at the global level of indicators. So that's a quick reflection from my side. Thank you. Marcos? Sorry, Rafaela.
Yeah, well, Rafaela, go for it, yeah.
No, just to reflect on what Daniel just said, that's really much what we're seeing at country level. The issue of, it's actually very sobering to see that there's so much data at country level that people ignore about. And like very much the first question is like, look around and check what are the data that are available, and even the studies and everything, and do a state-of-the-art analysis before you get into collecting new data. There is that tendency of like, we have an issue, we're going to design a very specific survey and we're going to collect new data. And actually, most of the time, it's not fully necessary, and it's not sustainable either. So it's more about building sustainable and national information systems that are more agile. That's what I was saying. And maybe I can answer a little bit on COVID as well, that are a little bit more agile, lighter, and that would help having more timely data instead of multiplying the very specific and sometimes very small scale surveys for collecting new data to answer a very specific question. And for us, the question is accessibility of data and capacities, just like you said, to process those data, to integrate them, to make them speaking to each other. And that's a very key challenge, technical challenge. And if we can invest more, maybe that would support the use of data into policy making and delivery.
Thank you. Marcos.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think that I agree with the comments, the replies from Rafael and Daniel. Essentially, the solutions to inequality in the countries have to come from the countries and from the countries themselves. And for that, they need to have the data, produce themselves according to their needs. You give an example, for instance, if I take PISA, like a learning is not very useful for the point of view of country which go lower levels, because it doesn't actually measure the inequality at the very bottom of the learning distribution and what are the issues behind that. So that sort of things that they need to be produced by the country, but for that they need capacity building, they need money, etc. Okay, that's the root of inequality, not only in education system, but across the world, really, no? That's the point. But the solution has to come from the bottom with local solution, with local data. I mean, I put that as a first stage, well before international comparisons, in my view.
Great, thank you very much. Right, we do need to move on to the next part of the day. We do have some still burning questions. Hopefully, we'll be able to come back to those questions later on in the session. What we're going to do now is have people work in smaller groups. And the way that we're going to do that is through Padlets. But before we move on to that, just to say a huge thank you to Rafaela from the GPE, Marcos from University of Sussex, and Daniel Shepherd for the fascinating and very stimulating presentations that we just heard. And in the hope that we'll be able to come back to some of these additional questions here.